It was New Year's Eve, 2016, when the storm hit. I had been staying in my family's remote cabin in northern Minnesota, an annual tradition of mine to escape the city and spend a quiet holiday away from the chaos. Snow had been falling steadily since early afternoon, but as the sun set, it intensified into a full-blown blizzard. By the time the clock struck 7 p.m., the world outside the cabin was a swirling white abyss. The cabin itself was small and cozy, nestled deep in the woods with no neighbors for miles. The only sound was the howling wind and the occasional creak of the old wooden beams. It was peaceful, until the knock. The sound was faint at first, barely audible over the storm. A single, deliberate knock, followed by silence. At first, I thought I had imagined it. Who could possibly be out in this weather? But then it came again, louder this time. I hesitated, my heart pounding as I approached the door. The peephole offered no view, just a distorted blur of white snow. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaky. No response. Just the wind. Finally, I cracked the door open, the cold biting against my skin as I peered outside. A man stood on the porch, bundled in a heavy coat and scarf, his face obscured by a hood. His stance was rigid, and his breath came out in thick, white puffs. "Please," he said, his voice muffled but urgent. "My car broke down a few miles back. I'm lost." Reluctantly, I let him in. It felt cruel to leave someone out in a storm like this. He stamped the snow off his boots and removed his hood, revealing a face chiseled by the cold, with sharp, gaunt features and piercing blue eyes. He introduced himself as Aaron, and though his story seemed plausible, something about him felt off. I offered him a mug of coffee, which he accepted with trembling hands. As he warmed himself by the fire, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in my chest. He was polite but evasive, dodging simple questions about where he was headed and why he had been driving through such an isolated area. The storm raged on, trapping us together for the night. As the hours dragged on, small, unsettling details began to pile up. I noticed Aaron's hands. Though he had been outside in the freezing cold, they were unscathed, not red or frostbitten as I expected. His clothes, too, were dry, despite the blizzard. Then there was the way he watched me when he thought I wasn't looking. His gaze was sharp, almost predatory. Around 11 p.m., I excused myself to the bathroom, locking the door behind me. My phone had no signal, but I still dialed 911 out of desperation, hoping the call might go through. No luck. My reflection in the mirror looked as pale and shaken as I felt. When I returned to the living room, Aaron was gone. The front door was wide open, snow piling up on the threshold. I stepped outside, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, but he was nowhere to be seen. His footprints, however, told a strange story. They didn't lead back down the driveway toward the road. Instead, they circled the cabin, over and over, as if he had been pacing. And then they stopped abruptly, vanishing into the untouched snow. I slammed the door shut and locked it, every muscle in my body tense. The fire had burned low, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and sat on the couch, my back to the wall, listening for any sound beyond the wind. Midnight came and went. The storm began to ease, but the sense of dread only grew stronger. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I woke to the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and coming from upstairs. The knife clutched in my hand, I crept up the narrow staircase, each step creaking under my weight. The cabin only had 2 small bedrooms, both of which I had checked earlier and found empty. The footsteps led me to the guest room. The door was ajar, and as I pushed it open, my heart nearly stopped. The room was empty, but the window was wide open, snow blowing in and covering the floor. And there, on the windowsill, were wet footprints. I bolted back downstairs, intending to grab my keys and leave, storm or not. But when I reached the living room, Aaron was standing there, his face illuminated by the dying firelight. "You shouldn't have let me in," he said softly. I don't remember much after that. Just the overwhelming cold as I ran out into the snow, the knife slipping from my frozen fingers. The storm swallowed me whole, and for a moment, I thought I would die out there. When I finally reached the main road, a passing snowplow found me and brought me to safety. The driver called the sheriff, but when they returned to the cabin, it was empty. No sign of Aaron, no footprints, nothing to suggest he had ever been there. To this day, I don't know who or what Aaron was. All I know is that every New Year's Eve, when the snow falls heavy and the wind howls, I can still hear that knock. It was New Year's Eve, 2018, and I had agreed to spend the night at my best friend Sam's family cabin. We'd been close since childhood, and the plan was simple, a quiet celebration away from the chaos of city parties. Just the two of us, a few drinks, and the snow-covered wilderness of the Cascades. The cabin was remote, nestled deep in the forest. Sam's parents used it as a summer retreat, and by winter, it was usually inaccessible due to the heavy snowfall. But that year, a milder season had left the road passable, and Sam was eager to show off the place. We arrived in the late afternoon, the low winter sun casting long shadows through the towering trees. The cabin was small but cozy, its walls lined with family photos and shelves filled with old books. The air smelled faintly of cedar and wood smoke, and for a while, everything felt perfect. Until the lights appeared. It started just after sunset. We were sitting in the living room, nursing beers and playing cards, when Sam glanced out the window and froze. "Do you see that?" he asked, his voice tight. I turned to look. Through the trees, faint points of light flickered in the distance. They weren't headlights or flashlights, they were too steady, too rhythmic. They shimmered like stars, shifting in and out of view as the wind stirred the branches. "What is that?" I asked, standing to get a better look. "No idea," Sam said. "Probably just hunters or something." But his tone was unconvincing, and the uneasy look on his face told me he didn't believe his own words. The lights didn't move closer, but they didn't go away, either. They hovered just beyond the tree line, pulsing softly like distant beacons. After a while, we tried to ignore them, returning to our game and turning up the music to drown out the silence. But the lights lingered in the back of my mind, a quiet gnawing unease that refused to let go. By 9 p.m., they were still there. Sam suggested we step outside for a closer look. Reluctantly, I agreed, bundling up against the cold as we grabbed flashlights and headed into the snow. The air was bitterly cold, each breath visible as a white puff in the moonlight. The snow crunched loudly under our boots as we made our way toward the lights. As we approached the tree line, the lights seemed to grow brighter, almost as if they were reacting to our presence. They weren't stationary, I realized, they floated just above the ground, weaving slowly between the trees in an unnatural, deliberate pattern. "What the hell is this?" Sam muttered. We stopped a few yards from the lights, our flashlights illuminating nothing but snow and bare branches. Up close, the lights were even stranger, soft, white orbs that seemed to pulse in time with my racing heartbeat. There was no source, no wires, no explanation for what we were seeing. And then they moved. The orbs floated toward us, their motion smooth and silent. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my feet felt rooted to the ground. Sam grabbed my arm, his grip like a vice. "Back to the cabin," he whispered, his voice trembling. We stumbled back through the snow, the lights following us at a distance. By the time we reached the porch, they had stopped, hovering just beyond the tree line. We locked the door behind us and stood in silence, staring out the window. The lights remained where we'd left them, unmoving but impossibly watchful. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Sam shook his head, his face pale. "Wait it out. They'll go away." But deep down, I knew he didn't believe that. The hours dragged on. Midnight approached, and the lights still lingered, their soft glow cutting through the darkness like eerie sentinels. We tried to distract ourselves with TV, but the signal was spotty, and the static only heightened our nerves. Every creak of the old cabin made us jump, every gust of wind against the windows sounded like something trying to get in. At 11:45, the power went out. The cabin was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the faint glow of the wood stove and the ever-present orbs outside. Sam lit a few candles, his hands trembling as he fumbled with the matches. The shadows cast by the flickering flames seemed to dance and twist, filling the room with an oppressive sense of unease. Then we heard the sound. It was soft at first, like a distant hum, barely audible over the crackle of the fire. But it grew louder, a low, resonant tone that seemed to vibrate in my chest. The lights outside began to shift, their glow intensifying as they drifted closer to the cabin. "Do you hear that?" I asked, my voice shaking. Sam nodded, his eyes wide with fear. It's coming from the lights. The hum grew louder still, a pulsating rhythm that seemed to fill the entire cabin. I could feel it in my bones, an unnatural vibration that made my teeth ache. The lights were at the edge of the porch now, their glow spilling through the windows and casting strange, shifting patterns on the walls. And then the knocking started. It wasn't loud, just a soft, deliberate tapping on the front door. But it was enough to send a wave of panic through me. Sam grabbed the fire poker, his knuckles white as he held it like a weapon. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice cracking. The knocking stopped, replaced by the sound of footsteps circling the cabin. Heavy, deliberate, and too slow to be human. The lights outside pulsed in time with the footsteps, their glow brightening with each step. I don't know how long we sat there, frozen in terror, as the footsteps continued. The knocking resumed, this time on the windows, then the back door, then the walls themselves. It was everywhere at once, surrounding us, closing in. At midnight, everything stopped. The lights vanished, the hum faded, and the cabin fell silent. For a long time, we didn't move, didn't speak, too afraid to even breathe. When we finally worked up the courage to check outside, there was nothing but fresh snow and an empty forest. No footprints, no sign that anything had been there. Sam and I left the cabin the next morning, abandoning our plans to stay through the weekend. We never spoke about that night again, and I haven't been back to the mountains since. But every New Year's Eve, when the clock strikes midnight, I hear it in my dreams, the hum, the footsteps, and the faint glow of the lights that still haunt the forest. It was New Year's Eve, 2020, and I had joined my boyfriend Jake and his sister Mallory at their family's lakeside cabin in Michigan. The cabin was a family tradition, a rustic retreat where they celebrated holidays every year. I'd been invited to join them for the first time, and I was looking forward to a quiet weekend of snowy views, hot cocoa, and ringing in the new year by the fire. The cabin was as charming as Jake had described, perched on the edge of a frozen lake and surrounded by dense pine trees. Snow blanketed the ground, and the air was crisp and still. Inside, a massive stone fireplace roared with warmth, and strings of lights cast a soft glow over the wood-paneled walls. It felt safe. Cozy. That feeling didn't last. The first strange thing happened just as the sun set. We were gathered around the fireplace, sipping mulled wine, when Mallory glanced out the large picture window and froze. "Do you see that?" she asked, her voice tight. Jake and I turned to look. At first, I saw nothing but the dark outline of the lake and the trees beyond. Then, I spotted it, a faint light bobbing at the far edge of the frozen water. It wasn't bright enough to be a flashlight or lantern, and it flickered irregularly, almost like a flame. "Probably just someone ice fishing," Jake said dismissively. "But who would be out there now?" Mallory countered. "It's freezing, and it's almost dark." Jake shrugged, but I could tell he was uneasy. The light lingered, shifting slightly, before winking out as if it had never been there. We tried to shake off the incident, turning our attention back to the fireplace and the snacks Mallory had laid out. Jake put on music to drown out the quiet, but I couldn't stop glancing at the window. The darkness outside seemed thicker than usual, the kind that swallowed the light. At 8 p.m., the power went out. The cabin plunged into darkness, the only illumination coming from the fireplace and the candles we hurriedly lit. Jake grabbed a flashlight and went to check the breaker box, but nothing worked. "Must be the storm," he said, though the weather outside was calm. We decided to make the best of it, huddling near the fire with blankets and playing card games by candlelight. But the sense of unease lingered, and I caught Mallory glancing at the window more than once. At 9:30, the light returned. This time, it was closer. It hovered near the middle of the frozen lake, brighter than before. It flickered in an almost hypnotic rhythm, drawing my eyes to it like a moth to a flame. "I don't like this," Mallory said, her voice trembling. Jake tried to reassure us. "It's probably just someone out there with a lantern. Maybe they got stranded." Mallory shook her head. "Who would just stand there? It hasn't moved." I couldn't argue with that. The light didn't bob or sway as if it were being carried. It just hovered, fixed in place. Jake suggested we go check it out, but Mallory and I protested. The idea of walking out onto that frozen lake in the pitch dark was unthinkable. Instead, we locked the doors and tried to ignore it. But the light didn't go away. It stayed there, unwavering, until around 10:15, when it started to move. The light began drifting toward the cabin, slowly at first, then faster. It stopped just short of the shore, casting an eerie glow over the snow. I could feel my chest tighten as I stared at it. It didn't feel natural. It felt alive. "What the hell is that?" Jake muttered, his bravado gone. We stood frozen, watching the light pulse softly. Then, we heard it. A knock at the door. It was soft but deliberate, 3 slow knocks that echoed through the cabin. Jake grabbed the poker from the fireplace and motioned for us to stay back. He approached the door cautiously, peering through the peephole. "There's no one there," he whispered, his face pale. The knocking came again, louder this time. Mallory clutched my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "Don't open it," she begged. Jake didn't. Instead, he bolted the door and backed away, his eyes darting between us and the windows. The light outside pulsed brighter, almost as if it were taunting us. The knocking stopped, replaced by a faint scratching sound that moved along the walls of the cabin. It circled us, slow and methodical, as if something, or someone, was testing the barriers. The light outside began to flicker erratically, its rhythm quickening like a heartbeat. And then, the sound of footsteps. They were heavy, deliberate, crunching through the snow outside. I held my breath, my heart pounding as the footsteps stopped just beneath the window. I didn't dare look, but Mallory let out a small gasp. "There's someone out there," she whispered. Jake shone his flashlight toward the window, but it reflected off the glass, revealing nothing but darkness. The scratching resumed, louder now, accompanied by faint whispers that seemed to come from every direction. At 11:45, the whispers stopped. The light outside vanished, plunging us into an oppressive silence. We sat huddled together by the fire, too afraid to move. Midnight was approaching, and the air felt heavy, charged with something I couldn't name. Then, the countdown began. The clock on the mantel, which hadn't worked in years, started ticking. Each second felt louder than the last, echoing through the cabin like a metronome of dread. When the hands struck midnight, the knocking returned, more forceful than before. Jake shouted at whatever was out there. "Leave us alone." The response was immediate. The windows shattered inward, a freezing gust of wind extinguishing the fire and the candles. The cabin was plunged into darkness, and the whispers returned, louder, angrier. I don't remember much after that. Just the sensation of being pulled, weightless, as if the floor had vanished beneath me. The sound of Mallory screaming, Jake shouting, and the relentless pulse of that infernal light. When I woke, it was morning. The cabin was intact, the windows unbroken, and the fire burning low in the hearth. Jake and Mallory were gone. I stumbled outside, searching for any sign of them. The snow was pristine, untouched, except for a single trail of footprints leading from the cabin to the middle of the lake, and stopping abruptly. The light was gone. The police found no evidence of foul play, no explanation for their disappearance. To this day, I don't know what happened that night. But every New Year's Eve, when the clock strikes midnight, I see that light in my dreams. And I know it's waiting for me.